Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted, the podcast available for SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes or any other podcast player of your choice, and of course on YouTube as a full video with photography to illustrate the points I'm making. In today's podcast I'd like to take a look at a really very small part of a watch, the second track. Now I appreciate this might be a somewhat nerdy point to discuss because, quite honestly, for most watch wearers the second track is totally irrelevant. But I think it's an important part of any watch, especially if you have something at a higher level of watchmaking, because let's not forget that the accuracy of your chronometer is only as good as the printing is where the second track is concerned. After all, that's where you see the seconds, and realistically, that's the place where you're going to see deviation throughout the day, whether it's gaining time or losing time. But when you think of a second track, one does think of something simple, something which just displays the seconds. But there are so many variations into graduations between the seconds, variations in design of the second track and placement on the dial, closer or further away from the centre depending upon functions and features. There's a lot to talk about, particularly because I think that a lot of brands are not giving these second tracks the due attention they deserve, given their importance. And there are plenty of seemingly bizarre things which watch brands do, from removing the second track on a watch which clearly needs it, like a chronograph, or veering towards a very technical appearance without actually understanding what the second track is there to do, and the fact that legibility clearly must be of importance. So today I'd like to take you on a tour of all the places where brands tend to go wrong, and watches which really have made a pig's ear of displaying this very simple function. But I'd also like to highlight some of the best watches in terms of highlighting the seconds, and some of the very clever approaches which have been taken, like a very cunning Longines, which was released many decades ago, but remains perhaps the most accurate watch in terms of reading the seconds on the dial. Of course, if you enjoy this podcast, please remember to follow us on whichever podcast player you enjoy using, and subscribe on YouTube to always catch the latest. Also remember that you can catch all of these podcasts, as well as other reviews and articles on watchchronicler.com, the very centre of Watch Chronicler and the content which is produced here. Of course, I'd have to be pretty obtuse to say that all watches have to have a second track, and indeed a lot of watches don't even show the individual minutes beyond every 5 minutes, like the Patek Philippe Ellipse or a dress watch of that nature, with just 2 hands, and a very casual attitude to life with regards to simply being a watch to keep you on time, but not too much. And clearly this speaks of the elegance and the style which is behind the general vision, the idea of wearing such a watch, which Patek Philippe and every other dress watch manufacturer, or certainly every other luxury dress watch manufacturer, aspires to present. And clearly there are also moments where the second track is dictated largely by the style of the watch. And this makes sense too if you're producing something vintage inspired. Clearly in the early 20th century it wasn't uncommon, as a carryover from previous pocket watches, to have a railway-style second and minute track around the edge of the dial, although of course on that age of watch it generally was a minute track, as a consequence of most having small seconds, by virtue of being a simpler arrangement within the watch, and requiring fewer wheels to power small seconds as opposed to central seconds. Historically, of course, such arrangements did make sense, not just in terms of stylistic choices, but also because these were a very effective way of printing the dial and presenting as large markers as you possibly could within the stylistic constraints of the era. But then in the field of dress watch production in general, the fact that small second watches and full-size central second watches are roughly equivalent in terms of popularity, albeit with the central second choice being a much more common choice for brands to choose just by virtue of movement selection, one does have to realise the fact that often seconds have absolutely no use on a daily basis beyond displaying the functioning of the watch. Perhaps once in a blue moon the second hand will be used to time basic intervals during daily life, or for the more obsessive of us with a chronometer, or simply those with the penchant for the nostalgia of the history of chronometers and the accuracy which they presented, the second hand can be extremely useful for setting the watch exactly to the second in relation to coordinated time. But whereas it's no crime to have too little on the dial, it may just be a crime to have too much there. Now, this is to say that on a lot of watches, the second track is very complicated. And I mean this by the fact that between every second, you'll see graduations which present fifths of a second, or quarters of a second, or thirds of a second, depending upon the watch. And often these simply don't fit within the functions of the timepiece, or the intended functions of the timepiece. Take, for example, a 3-hand watch like a Sinn 104, a watch which has a very clear, very legible dial with 3 hands and a very heavily graduated second track. Using an ETA or Solita movement, this watch runs at 4 Hz, so 8 ticks per second, so clearly the second hand is able to hit every one of those markers, but you aren't able to see it. in the sense that this isn't a chronograph. This isn't a watch where you're going to be specifically looking at a stopped hand to tell exactly how long something has taken. You're watching a hand gently waft across the dial, and clearly, if you're setting the watch, you're not going to set it at, let's say, 12:04 and 37.5 seconds. You're going to choose a dead second or perhaps 12 o'clock to be able to set the hands. Choosing a break or interval between seconds seems counterproductive and counterintuitive, given that you're never going to be quite as precise when you're setting the watch if you put it on top of a specific second. So the functionality here is really not there. There's no reason to have these additional marks, and the funny thing is that in a sense you're actually reducing the legibility of the watch, in the sense that you're reducing the potential length of those individual second markers and the ability to see them at a glance whilst looking down at your wrist. Of course, in the case of the 104, the argument could reasonably be put forward that these markings are not indeed to be used with the second hand, but rather with the hour and minute hands. But the reality here is that it's difficult to argue that too, because this watch presents the time with syringe hands with a very pointed tip, which means that you can read between the minute markings. But in any case, the seconds, or minutes, if you read them that way, are divided into 5 sections, so that means increments of 12 seconds, which seems like a very, very difficult way of reading the interval between individual minutes, when you could just look at the second hand. Nevertheless, I am prepared to concede that a chronograph does require these graduations. Certainly for a chronograph which aims to appeal to, for example, the racing segment, there is going to be a definite need, even if it's virtually vestigial in terms of usage on a daily basis as a result of electronic timing, that a watch would need to show these breakdowns between seconds. Also, you will, after all, be inspecting the dial after you've stopped the second hand, so you'll have time to examine it and see exactly where it falls on the dial. But even so, there are certain applications where even a chronograph can't justify this additional clutter on the dial. Take, for example, a diving chronograph. This is a watch whereby the second hand is the less important hand where the chronograph is concerned. Really, the second hand is just showing that the chronograph is still running. Ultimately, it's the minutes you need to pay attention to, because these will allow you to be able to tell decompression times or whatever else you might be using it for in a diving context. And the addition of these markings between minutes or seconds only makes the dive watch more difficult to read, and therefore less effective at what it's meant to be doing. But speaking of too complex second tracks, I think the best example ever seen of a watch to be able to carry this off with a very, very simple second track but with no loss in functionality was the Longines. This chronograph is essentially unique and has been produced in several iterations. Certainly the originals are now fetching quite a lot of money, but there have been remakes since. And this is a watch which has simple 1-second graduations all the way around the dial and is a chronograph. So one has to wonder, how are you supposed to tell where within that second you fall when you hit the chronograph button to stop it and measure the time? Well, the second hand on this watch is unique. It's a long, brightly coloured second hand with graduations with numbers running from its tip across around the dial. And this seems very cumbersome and odd until you use it. You see, when you stop the chronograph, you read where the tip of the second hand lands, but that's not the end of it. What you then have to do is look at which of the graduated numbers on the protrusion from that second hand lands most squarely on top of any other marker around the dial. And from that you can tell whether the chronograph hand stopped at 15 seconds, 15.1, 15.2, 15.3, or wherever else within that second, in order to give you a really fantastic and extremely intuitive readout of just where it lands without having to have additional clutter on the dial itself. But I realise that I'm perhaps nitpicking with that particular approach to choosing watches for pure legibility, because after all, most tool watches, quote unquote, are not used for their particular application or the application they were designed for. But nevertheless, one does have to appreciate that a lot of people will still want to time things with their chronograph and expect to be able to read it at any point on the dial. And so if a watch needs to have such a complex second track, surely breaking that track with a date window or other obstruction is a problem. I would argue that it is, because older watches tended to solve this issue by simply printing over other functions, such as a chronograph printing over the subdials in order to show the second track unbroken around the full rotation of the dial. Today, though, this is stylistically frowned upon and tends to appear pretty old-fashioned and unappealing to those who aren't particular enthusiasts. But just as there are plenty of watches which manage to separate other functions from the second track, there are plenty which don't, like for example these various Zenith El Primeros designed by Bamford in London, where either the second track is entirely removed, which doesn't seem to make much sense for a high beat, high precision chronograph, or there's a cutout for the date, which doesn't show the second track on its edge. Now historically, and even recently, Zenith tend to be very, very good at printing the second track on the date window around the edge in order for you to be able to continue reading the seconds all the way around there if you have the misfortune of having to stop the chronograph and read it during that point at which it's over the date. But there are other examples too. Take the very recent IWC tribute to 3705, which is a pretty exciting new pilot's watch released over the last couple of days, and which celebrates the 1994 release of essentially the world's first ceramic chronograph in a widely used, widely appreciated context. And that was a very important watch at the time, but crucially it was a tool. It was an unbelievably legible watch with that black ceramic case which has now become so legendary. Importantly, the luminous marker at 12 o'clock was a triangle which didn't actually cut into the very finely graduated second track going around the full circumference of the dial. Instead, with this new tribute model, they've given it a traditional 1940s Flieger-style marking at 12 o'clock, and I realise I'm really getting into the nerdy stuff here, but bear with me, because the marking for that is a triangle with a dot on either side, a sort of precursor, you could say, to what we see on a modern Speedmaster. But the problem here is those dots take up several graduations on either side of 12 o'clock, so if you happen to stop your chronograph in that particular space, it's very difficult to tell exactly where it falls if indeed you want to be able to read it to the same accuracy and precision as seen elsewhere around the dial. Perhaps the worst example of all is the Oris Chronoris 1970s Grand Prix Limited Edition, which is a chronograph with a very complicated dial as a result of having a GMT function in addition to a very large chronograph display. But here you can only really see about 2/3 of the second track, which is completely cut off by the enormous subdials at 12 and 6, which seems like a very odd choice for something conceived to at least celebrate the timing of racing cars. But now we come to the third and perhaps most specific element of producing a functioning and useful second track, and that's providing the correct interval for the correct beat rate. Now most of you out there will be very aware that different watches run at very different beat rates, with something like a Seiko running at 21,600 vibrations per hour, equating to 6 ticks per second, then going up to 8 ticks per second for your average ETA, 10 ticks per second for, let's say, a Zenith El Primero with a high beat movement, or 7 ticks per second being a popular in-between for coaxial and more recent Longines watches, which need a balance between power reserve and finesse where the second hands travel around the dial is concerned. But as a result of this, you need a dial with graduations by which the beat rate is divisible, otherwise you're going to end up with a strange situation where the hand never hits any of the markings, and indeed couldn't from a mechanical perspective. But the result here is that you end up with a dial which doesn't really add anything by being more complicated, because you can't actually read the watch more precisely as a result. An example of how not to do it is, weirdly, the unbelievably popular Rolex Daytona, which runs at a 4 Hz beat rate, so 8 ticks per second, and yet shows 5 increments within each second, a setup which simply couldn't work with the movement, which is a peculiar arrangement, but one which I suppose has stood the test of time and so hasn't been changed. Rather amusingly, this is one of the things rectified by the 2021 Omega Speedmaster Professional. You see, when the original Speedmaster was launched in 1957, it used the caliber 321, which is of course today a very famous column wheel chronograph movement with manual winding. And this was used all the way through the late 50s and 60s until the early 70s. And crucially, this movement beat at 18,000 vibrations per hour, so that's 5 ticks per second. And they graduated their dials in a corresponding manner, so they gave 5 increments between every second on the dial to make it easy to read. However, when they moved to the 861, the successor to that 321, the beat rate increased to 21,600 vibrations per hour, and therefore 6 ticks per second. The problem was, though, that the dials were left the same, and so there was no possible division between the two to make the second hand actually hit those markers. And crucially, now in 2021, Omega have rectified the problem with their recent movement, the caliber 3861, 2 generations after the original 861. And so what they've chosen to do is simply to have 2 hash marks between every second in order to give 3 increments of movement, and therefore to fit with the beat rate of the watch to give you really accurate and precise reading. This is a really clever level of detail and something which I don't think was widely appreciated as one of the bigger changes, but it is a crucial change given that it's the first time that Omega has rectified the dial. Strangely, some watches can really go off the rails in this regard, such as the otherwise really phenomenal Zenith Chronomaster Sport El Primero 3600, released very recently, and with a very clever movement which allows the seconds to be shown in a far, far larger way on the dial, with the second hand completing one orbit of the dial every 10 seconds. But the point is that the second hand covers 12 minutes on the dial in normal terms every second, and in 10 distinct jumps as per the beat rate of this watch. However, the intersecond graduations remain, despite it being impossible to use them even for the minutes, with a flat-tipped end to the minute hand, meaning that you can't actually read them between those markers. Even if you were going to try to read the minutes on those very finely graduated points on the dial, they would be broken into 5 parts, which would make sense for the beat rate of the chronograph, and indeed for previous El Primeros, which would have beat 10 times between every second, but reading this from the minute hand is simply an impossibility. In this context, it does show, in some ways you could say, that the Omega Speedmaster Professional is in this regard one of the most sensible and serious watch designs even today, because of the consideration which has gone into that watch and which hasn't into other watches on the market. What do you think of this analysis of second tracks on watches? Clearly it's a very specific and very niche interest and even something to pay attention to, but I think it's a very important part of the style of a watch and indeed the functionality, which, even for someone who's not going to use the watch for its intended function, is appealing to know that the watch is designed for that and designed well for it. So let me know in the comments section here on YouTube what you think of this podcast, and of course follow us on whichever podcast player you enjoy using to always catch the latest. But thank you very much for watching and listening. This is Armon from WatchChronicle.com, out.